Hey everyone, Justin Lum here with Fox 10 Phoenix, investigative reporter, and we are covering the Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow case. Yes, it's been a couple of weeks since Chad Daybell, the so-called Doomsday Prophet, was sentenced to death for the murders of J.J. Vallow, Tylee Ryan, and Tammy Daybell. We've been covering this case and this saga since 2019, and joining me is Fremont County prosecuting attorney Lindsey Blake. Lindsey, you have been on this for more than 2 years, but really 2 straight years of trials, the preparation, getting through both the Lori Vallow trial and Chad Daybell trial, both ending in convictions for both co-defendants, husband and wife here. First off, just what is it like getting through a 9-week trial, this marathon like you did, and it ending the way that it did?
Well, of course, we were pleased with the outcome in this case. I always say you never know for sure what's going to happen in a jury trial. Once we presented our case and we turn it over to the jury, it's just the wait and see for us, just like for any public or the victims involved. Especially for the victims, though, we're very pleased with the outcome of these cases. As far as what it's like, I always tell people it's kind of a struggle at the outset, especially in this case. We were moved over to Ada County, so we all had to pick up our lives and go over there as well. The prosecutors and the investigators involved in this case. But I feel like as you start the trial, at some point you kind of hit a stride and then you get in trial mode. And so you just go and you do your job and you do what you're over there to do and figure you'll take care of other things after we get this trial done.
You've been doing this for a long time, but for something like this in a capital case, is it really take it one day at a time, just really methodical with your approach? I mean, the amount of witnesses that you guys called on, it was a large number.
Yes, and it's always a bit of a struggle. So what people don't see on the back end is we do have some incredible staff, some incredible people working to make the travel arrangements, to make that witness contact, to make sure we can get people there, have them ready to go. So it is absolutely a team effort. You always run into hiccups in a trial. I've never had one that I don't run into a hiccup. In a trial of this magnitude, there were some scheduling issues that came up, so we would just shuffle witnesses around. Luckily, we had witnesses that were very willing to work with us on that, as we had to modify the schedule a little bit here and there. So that was really lucky for us, that we had such great witnesses to work with. But it is definitely a challenge in a case with this many witnesses to make those arrangements. I think you have an overall plan, and then, like I said, you have to be willing to kind of pivot and move when it doesn't go quite the way you think it's going to. So every night you're doing some additional witness prep, even though we were done with court for the day by 3:30, sometimes a little earlier. Then it was moving on to witness prep or other things that needed to be done.
And really trying to get everyone on time and on schedule. You talked about sometimes, scheduling doesn't always work out, but you're also trying to tell the jury a story and make everything make sense, because this is such a complex case with multiple law enforcement agencies, multiple jurisdictions, different family members and friends of 3 different victims. So how much is the teamwork between you 4 attorneys the factor? And really, the work isn't done after court is adjourned every day, right?
Right. The teamwork in this case was incredible. With the 4 attorneys, we were able to split up some of the workload. And so you're able to have somebody working on one project while somebody may be prepping their witness for the next day. So that absolutely is instrumental. And we did have a great working relationship amongst the attorneys on this case. Again, that was super helpful. We're pulling attorneys from different offices that don't work together at day to day. And so that was absolutely a challenge. Very similar in Lori's case, right? We had 5 attorneys. Not all of us work together every day. So building that team relationship in order to be able to work together in a trial of this magnitude was absolutely instrumental. We definitely had an idea of the witness order that we wanted to go in. And so that's kind of what I was alluding to with you have to just be ready to pivot and move. When we ran into witness complications with getting someone there, we just had to be ready to say, hey, I've got a witness that I can put in, and just keep moving through it. And that's where the team effort really makes a big difference.
And as we'll talk about in just a moment, I mean, there's so many elements and factors in this bizarre, crazy case besides the religion and the financial factors, and so many players. And people and multiple co-conspirators in the case, a little bit larger amount of witnesses this time around compared to Lori's trial. Did you have a group of witnesses that you knew could really hit the jurors hard with the evidence they would see? Your strongest witnesses that you were, in your mind, okay, we need to really, really perform here, do our job with these witnesses we call to the stand?
Yeah, I think for me, every witness, if we decided to put them on the witness list, they brought something to the case. They had some important information or important details that we felt were very important for the jury to hear. I think obviously, as much as we could get in a defendant's own words, whether in text format, spoken format, any kind of written format at all, I think that is always super helpful for a jury to be able to see that information. Just figure out a way in the moment to move around things as best you can. But I do think every witness that we called to me absolutely had some bit of information, whether it was a lot or a little bit, that we felt was very important for the jury to hear.
Would you consider some of those key witnesses or star witnesses to be like a Zulema Pastenes, a Melanie Gibb, people that were part of that inner circle and could help you explain the teachings of Chad Daybell? Because, I mean, when you first hear this stuff, imagine the jury coming into this trial. It's really, really strange and complicated material.
Yes, it is. And it takes a minute to wrap your head around it. And so to me, I think having several witnesses that could talk about what Chad and Lori were saying, kind of the driving factors behind this and or what they were purporting to believe, was very important to try to get that across to the jurors. It's always hard for me to know which witnesses are going to be the absolute key witness to any individual. So each juror may have a different view on which witnesses were super instrumental to them. I did think that being able to provide that background and that story was very important, which is absolutely why we wanted those witnesses on our list, on our witness list, and to have their testimony presented to the jurors so they could weigh that out and see and get a little bit of that background at least. Of course, you never know exactly how it's going to resonate with the jurors, so you try your best to make sure that you're painting the picture as clear as possible, that you're allowing that witness to tell the story or to tell what information they have in a fashion that will resonate with the jury.
And I'm curious to this too. I mean, the research you had to do in the months and years really leading up to this, I mean, really since 2020, how did you wrap your head around this system, the light and dark scale? You really had to understand that first to be able to prosecute this case, to explain to the jury. I mean, what was that process for you like?
So I know it's been alluded to, there was a significant amount of discovery in this case. So of course, coming into it, and I'd actually started working on it a little bit before taking office as well, working with Rob Wood's office in anticipation of coming into this position once I was elected. So going through that discovery, and for me, it was just as much as I could get through, I wanted to learn it. As many witnesses, interviews as I could read or listen to, the jail phone calls, anything that I could do to try to make sure I had a good grasp and understanding of this, I absolutely tried to do it. And I think over time, as you listen to it, and this is information that everyone may view a little bit different, but I think as time went on, especially hearing the people that were closest to Chad and Lori explain it, you did start to get at least a bit of an understanding of how it worked. But for me, it was just going through as much information as I could, reviewing it, comparing it, making sure that I had a decent grasp of at least what I understood things to be.
Have you ever seen such voluminous discovery like this in your career?
I have not. I've worked on a few other homicide cases, worked on a variety of cases, but never discovery of this magnitude. There was a significant amount of information recovered, lots of interviews completed. I know it's been said before, but the investigation in this case was just immaculate, in my opinion. We had multiple agencies pooling resources, sharing information. So there was a significant amount of discovery to go through, but it was also, to me, very helpful to review that. Even interviews that maybe didn't pan out much information, it was nice to know that that had been done and be able to review those reports as well.
And some of the jurors that we've spoken to have said that the text messages really stood out. I mean, we're now in an age in this digital era where text messages, photos, everything is saved in the cloud. They pointed out the video of Lori and Chad poolside that stood out while, JJ and Tylee were already dead. And things like the planning of such a quick funeral for Tammy's death. Why do you think these sort of moments really stood out and took effect on a jury, like to be able to see these messages and see these co-defendants doing what they were doing in real time?
I think through those text messages, it gives you insight and a glimpse into what was absolutely going on. You hear witness testimony, and like I said, the jurors weigh out the credibility and they decide what weight to give it. I think when you have those text messages that are in a defendant's own words or a co-defendant's own words, I think that that can really resonate with most individuals. I think it lays it out. I think similarly, seeing the actual images of a defendant or a co-defendant, as opposed to just having that description, people will say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And absolutely, for some jurors, I think it is. Just seeing it rather than having it described for a lot of people can make a big difference. So that would be my guess as to why it resonated. Like I said, it's interesting to hear how different pieces of evidence or different witnesses hold different weight with different individuals.
What did you learn from Lori Vallow's trial that you sort of kept in your back pocket and took into Chad Daybell's trial? I'm going to assume that you felt even more prepared, just and be able to have that confidence of, okay, we have one down.
I think for me, anytime I go into a trial, I'm always a little bit nervous. You've done your planning, you've done your prep work. I'm nervous to see what is going to be a hiccup, what's going to be an obstacle that we have to overcome while we're going through the trial. But we did feel prepared. I do think having completed that trial before was helpful in some ways. Of course, in other ways, you're watching other things and making sure that things flow as smooth as possible. I think some of the jurors have talked about it from Lori's trial, but one of the things that we wanted to do in this case was present it a little more linear, because there was some feedback that the timeline can get a little bit confusing. There are a lot of events that take place. This case spans over a year. It can get confusing trying to keep those dates and events straight in anyone's mind, even if you've worked the case for a while. So I think that was a goal, and some of the feedback that we took was as much as possible presenting it in a linear fashion so that it allowed the jurors to follow along in a timeline.
Well, that totally makes sense. I was going to ask because, your team in opening statements right off the bat broke it down into chapters, and I want to know kind of what was the reason for that, how you guys came to that decision. I know Rob Wood handled opening statements this time, but I saw that theme of chapters used.
Yeah, and I won't take credit for that. So I think what we had talked about as a team was maybe presenting a bit of a timeline in the opening statement a little more clearly than we had in Lori's trial, to try to help with that right off the bat, some understanding of the linear events of things. So I think that played into the decision to present it in the chapters format. I don't want to speak for Mr. Wood, but I think that was a large part of that, and just trying to present that timeline, which I think he did a good job of doing.
Even today, what about this case now is still so strange to you, or what just really sticks out to you when you look back on this?
I've said before, this case is stranger than fiction. And I think as we went through learning the evidence and having team meetings and discussing things and discussing evidence and witness presentation and how we wanted to move forward, that theme came up a lot, that really this is stranger than fiction. Just the whole storyline. I think one thing that never goes away from a case like this is just our lack of ability to understand, and it's probably a good thing, but the lack of ability to understand how a mother could let this happen. I think anytime we have a case where a mother is involved in the killing of the kids or any planning or part of that, I don't think the public can ever fully wrap their heads around that. I don't think as a prosecutor I've ever been fully able to wrap my head around that. So that part of it, absolutely. Just the way that they went about it, the teachings, the moves, the travels, all of it is just different. I wouldn't anticipate seeing another case like this in my career.
And many have asked, right? Like, these two people could have just gotten a divorce. I mean, why didn't they just do something that had nothing to do with any criminal acts and just move on with their life? I think we'll always be left with the question, why did it get this far into such a horrific manner? The Arizona evidence is so huge in this case. I mean, we saw it in both trials. We saw detectives from Chandler, Gilbert, many witnesses come in and testify regarding the Charles Vallow case, that murder, and then the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, Lori Vallow's former nephew-in-law. But specifically for Charles, like, essentially, does he really help build this case, even though he was long gone, just by his text messages alone and everything he tried to do?
We definitely thought that those events, both the killing of Charles as well as the attempted shooting of Brandon Boudreaux, were significant to our case. So we did what was called a 404B motion in an attempt to be able to bring that information and evidence into the trial in our case, and the judge would give a limiting instruction. But absolutely, from the state's perspective, we felt that was beneficial in painting the whole picture. One of the biggest things was when I had come into office, Tammy's case was actually at the AG's office, and Rob Wood was handling the finding of the children's bodies as a special prosecutor as well. And one of the things was, as much as possible, we wanted to bring the case back together, at least with the Tammy and the children. And of course, we didn't have jurisdiction with Charles. But I think all of the events in this case help explain and show the totality of what was going on. So at least from the state's perspective, we felt that all that evidence was important enough to request permission from the court to present it.
Yeah, and really, that shooting in Chandler is like, it sets off this whole sequence of events, really this trail of death that happens. And even before Charles died, he had really pleaded with police, just trying to figure out what he could do for his wife at the time. Now, I really want to ask, and you mentioned this in the press conference just right after the death penalty sentence, about being a mother. And, I just have to ask how this case has, affected you. And maybe, I don't know, I know you're motivated for every case, but really just to see these photos of JJ and Tylee, to learn who they were and how loved they were, to be a mother yourself. I mean, this case had to mean a lot to you to really do it justice.
Yeah, so I became a mother actually, found out I was expecting right at the outset of while we were doing the grand jury proceedings. And so one thing for me is my son has never known his mom not working on these cases. And of course, they have taken time. And so that's going to be an adjustment for him, and I think a positive one. But when you look at that and you have your child and you look at what these other families lost, I can't imagine their loss, and I don't even pretend to understand the loss of the victims in this case. But meeting with their family members, meeting with their friends, having the victims brought to life is what absolutely helps spur you on. And every victim matters. And I think trying to give them a voice and do the best we can to seek justice, knowing that I can't guarantee anyone closure, even when the case is said and done, I don't know how the victims move on in their lives. I always tell every victim, however they react is appropriate, in the sense that if they're sad, if they're upset, I don't think anyone can know how we would react in that moment or how we'd move forward. So to be able to meet them, have the victims brought to life, but definitely as a mom, and that's when I talk about, as a society in general, not being able to wrap our heads around how a mother could allow that to happen, be part of that process, is just something that most of us will never be able to understand.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the co-conspirators in this case. You talked about Lori Vallow being part of that process, and it was sort of this bombshell in her trial when one of the witnesses, I think with the Idaho State Police, was able to testify to the fact that Lori Vallow's hair, a strand of hair, was found on the duct tape that was found on JJ. And, I think everybody was just, it made it more real that this happened. I mean, do you believe Lori Vallow had this physical direct involvement with her son's murder?
I don't know if we will ever know definitively how the events themselves played out. I think what we were able to glean from the evidence, obviously, is JJ is seen at Lori's apartment the last night that he's seen alive. And so, how the actual acts were carried out, I don't know if we'll ever know for sure. Definitely having that physical evidence tying someone to it absolutely makes one wonder if that's exactly what happened.
And obviously, if Alex Cox was still alive today, we can assume he'd be standing trial for his role in this, or alleged role in this. He never had a trial. But you also laid this out when talking to one of the witnesses on the stand, or asking questions about could have been possible that Tammy Daybell was restrained in her room while the asphyxiation happened, that possibly a second person could have been there. Like, will we ever know? But you also laid out the fact that the data had shown that Alex Cox's location by phone was about 2 miles away at a church. So is that the belief that he could have been in that room as well, assisting Chad Daybell?
I think that is obviously one of the investigative theories. Again, those are the questions that, without the key players ever really telling us the full events, we're never going to know for sure. I think both of the MEs for the state did talk about the fact that the bruises absolutely could be evidence of restraint. They both also testified absolutely it could be that there were two people. Of course, the MEs said that's not our role to say definitively how it happened, but that the injuries on Tammy that were seen, the bruising, could be consistent with that. They also talked about some different methods, and I believe even the defense expert touched on that, different methods that someone could be asphyxiated without leaving some of the signs that you would see with maybe a strangulation or other types of asphyxia. And so going through those, I think that absolutely is a theory, that is a potential way that things were carried out.
Now, I want to talk about not just your closing arguments, but both your closing arguments and your opening statements in Lori Vallow's trial, and your closing arguments in Chad's trial. You brought up the theme money, power, and sex, and that has really stuck with us in the media throughout this because it's easy to remember, it's strong, and you're about to explain your points throughout this trial after laying that theme out in such a complex case. How did you come to that as you were preparing for opening statements for Lori's trial to really put it into 3-4 words?
So, some members on the team were absolutely adamant, hey, we've got to have a strong theme here. We need to make sure that we have something that can resonate, but also sum up the case, sum up the theory of the state. And so we had met as an attorney team, and honestly, pretty quickly with the attorney team on the Lori case, that was the consensus. That's what this case was about when we really broke it down to just the basic facts and basic information. So it was a team decision to move forward with that type of a theme, and then just being able to lay it out exactly in the words that we wanted to present it.
And probably no factor that's more, I guess, stronger than the other between money, power, and sex. You sort of see them all, proven in trial for all the elements with the stories and testimony that we heard in the evidence. In the Vallow trial, we didn't see any witnesses called by the defense. And then in Chad Daybell's trial, you saw about 11. Was there any of the experts or anyone called that you thought, okay, well, that was legitimate. That might pose a challenge for us, one of these defense witnesses?
Think with every defense witness, you're open to hearing what they have to say, and that's the hope with the jury as well, right? That's what the jury's agreed to do, is come in and listen to the full case. So as we're listening to that testimony from the state, I think for the most part, a lot of the at least scientific evidence, things of that nature, really lined up because the data is what it is, the remains are what they are. So a lot of that was actually very similar between the experts, and I think we heard that in the trial, and there were questions along those lines. For me, I never know what's going to resonate with the jury. I always say I appreciate it when the defense comes in. They've got to present their case, and so we just try to pivot and move with it and address any issues as we see them come up in the trial. It's always hard to gauge what is going to resonate with the juror, so we just want to make sure to address it as clear as we can to counter it with the evidence that we feel the state has that is contrary to the defense.
Lindsey, I got to tell you this, we were live streaming the trial and sharing that, and thousands of people are watching every single day. And whenever the defense was done with direct questioning, if you were about to take the podium and recross, it was like, I want to compare it. It was like an event where these people were fans of you and they were so excited to see you recross. What is it about your process when you're listening to direct by defense and you're preparing to get back up there? Do you kind of get like just a feeling like, all right, let's do this? Like what is that like for you? Like, seems like that's obviously you enjoy your job, but something about recross where people were really looking forward to it when you were up there.
Well, number one, I'd say thanks for that. It's always nice to hear that there's people cheering us on and that there's that support. And hopefully that also means the information that I was presenting made sense to people. Because as a prosecutor, we never know. Well, as an attorney in general, it might make sense to us, but is it coming across clearly to everyone else? For me, when I'm trying to do my recross, you're taking notes, you're listening to what's being addressed. But I think my process is I don't necessarily want to hit every single point. I want to hit the key points. If I have evidence that I presented or that I think will come out that's going to counter that, I want to touch on that. For me, also, I wanted to do as much as I could to try to wrap it back and bring it back to what mattered in this case. So we may have been led down a different path by defense, different ideas that they wanted us to consider or think about, and things that in my mind may be more of a red herring. So as much as I could, I wanted to bring the focus back to the actual evidence that that witness might have, the actual information that we wanted to make sure the jury understood that this particular witness held this information, and just try to drive that home again. And in an attempt too to try to, if the jury had been diverted, to try to bring them back to the direction we were headed.
It's like a boxing match that is just going on forever because of all the witnesses. Which brings us to rebuttals, the state's rebuttal. And Chad Daybell's kids testified, and a lot of people that follow this case closely, of course, you want to hear what do they have to say, but I feel like they were exposed in the state's rebuttal because, as we know in testimony, Emma Murray says she had to interview with law enforcement to see her mom's autopsy results. Garth Daybell says he stayed up watching YouTube the night Tammy died and didn't hear any commotion from his parents' bedroom. What was your reaction to their testimony, knowing the information that you did have?
I think we had known some information going in, and of course, on the rebuttal side, we always try to have an anticipation or a plan. If this person takes the stand, or there are things that we may think we have evidence to counter, or that we may think that could be challenged by the state. So we already had somewhat of a plan in place of things that if the certain witnesses took the stand, it wasn't just those two, but if certain witnesses were to take the stand, did we have anything that we may want to bring in? And so that gets disclosed up front, and we had that idea that depending on what they said, we would use that evidence. So based on their testimonies, we'd already somewhat planned for that, and so it was a pretty easy decision at that point to say, well, let's let the jury hear this other evidence and let them weigh things out how they feel is appropriate.
And based on the events leading up to both of these trials, it seems like, and I guess their perception of law enforcement based on what they've said in testimony, was it pretty obvious they were never going to be state witnesses, these two?
I think there's always a chance that we can subpoena anyone, we could try to bring them in, but I think based on the lack of cooperation, there was some cooperation, so I don't want to make it sound like there was none by any means, but I think given their stance in the case, it wasn't really going to be prudent for the state to present them as witnesses. We also had that inclination that there was a good chance they were going to come in as defense witnesses, so we just took the approach of wait and see if they come in and what they have to say.
Gotcha. Now, we got to talk about this because this was sort of a stressful day for family members and people following the case and wanting justice. Take me through the day the court found the clerical error in the amended indictment, and simply the dates were just off on JJ's murder, but no one really caught it until weeks into trial. Were you concerned that charge could actually be dismissed? Like, what was that like, finding that out, and like, how could this happen?
Yeah, I think in the moment, because it hadn't been caught, as the judge said that, I think there was absolutely that moment of, oh no. And then thinking through the process. And once we'd met as a prosecution team, we really went through, okay, what happened? How did this happen? What are we really looking at here? For the state, at least, it became pretty clear that there were several avenues that would allow for this to be corrected somehow. While it couldn't be necessarily an amended indictment because the state had rested, case law provided various avenues. And one of the things that we realized pretty quickly was we had actually never had permission to amend that particular charge. We'd never even asked to amend that count. So the state felt pretty confident coming in. I do agree with the judge's decision on that, but I think the arguments presented by Ms. Beatty were all very plausible and all made sense to the state, that there were several different mechanisms available to allow that to be essentially corrected.
All right, just a couple more questions. Let's rewind back to 2020. How did you learn about this case, and what made you say, I need to be on this, if I'm elected?
So for me, I actually was working in Salt Lake at the time. I was with the Salt Lake District Attorney's office at the time that this story started to be publicized. So just starting with the missing kids. And I actually had some coworkers that were following it. And because I was from the area, they'd asked me if I knew anything about it. And of course I didn't. And as time went on, I actually, not even necessarily related to this case, I had several people from my hometown. I'm from St. Anthony originally. I had people reaching out asking me if I would be interested in running for the prosecutor position. I ended up agreeing to run up here, and once I was elected, and actually during the primary process as we were going through that, I believe my predecessor had just handed off Tammy's investigation to the Attorney General's office. So that was some question, and some of the things that came up during that primary election, people did have that question. There was a push from some members of the community to potentially bring that case back. So once I was elected, I think it was actually shortly after the children's bodies were found, I ended up getting in touch with Rob Wood with Madison County and made a decision to come back a little bit early and work with Rob's office to start familiarizing myself with the case, on the potential that we did end up with any of the case or all of it back in Fremont County. And then as we went through that process, like I said, I think to me, it was important to bring the case back together. We had a piece with the Attorney General's office. We had a piece with Madison County. So we wanted to make sure that we could combine those cases back together. So in conversations with the Attorney General's and then meeting with our sheriff's office to make sure they felt comfortable with that decision, we ended up bringing Tammy's piece back to Fremont County, and then meeting with Madison County, Rob Wood with Madison County. He and I had several meetings to discuss the possibility of joining forces, essentially combining resources to move forward in a joint prosecution of the cases as a whole. And that decision was made, and we were, with the COVID restrictions, it took a minute, but we were able to get a grand jury seated in Fremont County. We don't use that process a lot. I'd done a grand jury or a couple grand juries before when I was in Teton County, Idaho, but they're not used a lot in southeastern Idaho. And so that was a bit of a process. We had to get the grand jury seated first so we could even present the case. But that was kind of the decision making there, and deciding to, okay, we'll bring the case back and we'll do this.
Yeah, I almost forget sometimes in the midst of all this, we had a pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, dealing with that, with court restrictions and guidelines and things like that. And then Lori Vallow's competency, I mean, that was something that really slowed things down. So there's just so much that you and your team have been through, really in waves, with these obstacles. And so you're from St. Anthony, born and raised?
Yes.
What is that like to come back, get on this case, like first day on the job, and here we are? I mean, it's like, could you have predicted this as you were in law school?
Definitely not. I actually went to law school thinking I may end up trying to join the FBI one day, and life just took me down a different path. So I've done prosecution and defense work. I worked as a public defender for quite a while before switching to prosecution, but definitely you don't anticipate a case like this, at least not in the smaller communities in rural areas. This is not our typical case. So even coming back, I think, and before really getting into the full facts of this case, I couldn't have predicted exactly what this was going to look like or what I was walking into, but I was willing to accept the challenge and do my best for the victims to make sure that we did as thorough of a job as we could and tried our best to get an outcome that was acceptable to the victims' families and may allow them whatever peace and closure that they can get from this.
Yeah, I mean, these people in your hometown as you're getting groceries or you're getting gas for your car. I mean, this is your home, and this is such. This is a case that made international headlines. In 20 years, how will you look back on this story and how it's changed your life? Do you think?
That's a good question. I always hope that everything is solid on this, that we're not having to do too much with it in the future because you just never know. But I think looking back, I'm glad that I had this opportunity. I'm not glad that the crimes occurred. I always say if my position was erased tomorrow, that would be a great thing for society if we didn't need prosecutors anymore. But because we are needed, because these crimes do occur, I'm grateful and glad for the opportunity to have been able to work on this case, to meet the people that I met. The victims' families are absolutely incredible. The support that they showed the prosecution was just astounding to me. You don't always get that. And they were willing to put their faith in us and willing to support us and have meetings with us when we needed and provide that backing from their side, which was incredible. The investigation, like I said, the people that I've met working on this case, they're all amazing. And I tell them all I would be honored to work a case with any one of them any day of the week. So I think I'll look back on it with fondness of those relationships that were built. I think there's always going to be a sense of sadness and grief because anytime we have a homicide case, and I tell victims this, I can't ever make anything better for them, really, because I can't undo what's been done. I can't bring the victims back. And that's really hard. I tend to like to be somewhat of a problem solver if I can. I try to encourage victims to get assistance, help, therapy. But in this type of a case, there's nothing we can do to ever really make it better. So I think there'll always be that sense of sadness and grief, wondering the events that we're never going to know. Some of the questions you asked today, even, we'll never know some of the answers to the questions. So I think there will always be that sense of trying to piece it all together still in my mind to fully understand how these events happened, why they happened. I mean, we understand pretty well, but we don't know all the minute details that we just don't have access to. So there will always be that as well.
All right, Lindsey Blake, part of the state of Idaho's prosecution team that tried both Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow, now both convicted murderers. Lindsey, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.